Mm. Will you be here? What the talk? Afterwards. Huh?
read the final two paragraphs of the chapter on the word, Vak, where Sri Aurobindo has been revealing the Vedic perspective of the word, the relationship between the divine creative power of Vak and the human speech. And we have seen a close parallel, an analogy, a representation in human speech of that same power by which the divine manifests himself in a vibration of consciousness, which undergoes a series of successive densifications, beginning with the original creative supra-mental vibration, which then represents and reflects itself in a mental vibration, which then organizes a vital vibration in the life energies, which expresses itself in the material plane as a sound vibration, which then concretizes itself into material form. And so the Vak, the term in Sanskrit, covers this entire sweep of vibrational gradations of manifestation, of which the highest is the pranava, the original vibration, the creative Om, out of which, by which the whole universe is as if breathed into manifestation or chanted into manifestation. This word has in the manifestation its seed sounds, it has forms which stand behind, which compel the forms in the material world, and it has its rhythms. And the whole of life itself is a rhythm of God, Sri Aurobindo explains. We have seen in our study the deeper nuances of the sense of rhythm, and we saw examples also from Sri Aurobindo's writings and from his poetry of how the subtler gradations of rhythm can express themselves even in the most material form of speech. Before we proceed with the text proper, I felt strongly to share one more example of the rhythm, continuing as if from last time's description. And this is an example of a message that the mother gave after Sri Aurobindo had withdrawn his body, which message is also inscribed in the Samadhi. And because this occurred repeatedly for a few days in our own prayers as a group, the deeper rhythm of this stood out with some vividness, and I thought it worth sharing with you. The text goes thus: To thee, who hast been the material envelope of our Master, to thee, our infinite gratitude. Before thee, who hast done so much for us, who has worked, struggled, suffered, hoped, endured so much. Before thee, who has willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all for us. Before thee, we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. When written in prose, one does not so obviously see the subtler rhythms in which the words, the feelings, and the thoughts express themselves. But dwelling upon it, we see a certain pattern. To thee who hast been, and then to thee our infinite gratitude. After that, before thee, before thee, before thee, and ending again with to thee. Automatically, at a subliminal level, all these become as if reference points. Even as we read the prose, we tend to pause, we tend to highlight these initial phrases to thee, before thee, before thee, before thee, and ending with to thee. The thee being common, holding as if like a spine all these elaborations or unfoldings of each line. Then, when we look at the lines themselves, the first two, to thee who hast been the material envelope of our Master, to thee our infinite gratitude. It is as if the words stopping in the second line after just three words, our infinite gratitude, somehow in the matching with the first line, there is a gap. And the gap is filled with our soul leaning in gratitude before the Lord and the silence that follows automatically. So when we read, to thee who hast been the material envelope of our Master, to thee our infinite gratitude. And there is as if matching the rest of the words, the silence in which the whole being leans in gratitude. And then, before thee who has done so much for us, and then a series of phrases, who has worked, struggled, suffered, hoped, endured so much. The very formulation, the rhythm, the natural accent of the words forces us to pause with each word. You cannot say worked, struggled, suffered, hoped. Somehow it merges into each other. You're forced to separate with pauses. Worked, struggled, suffered, hoped. And already in that series of pauses, there is the sense of the effort, the struggle, the suffering, the endurance. Even in this speech, we are as if forced to follow the struggle and the effort and the endurance which is suggested. But the next line has a very different rhythm. Before thee, who has willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all for us. The all creates as if a smaller cycle of rhythms, but the rhythm of the words themselves, willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved all, has a very different rhythm from the previous line, and it is as if rising into peaks. Willed all, attempted all, prepared, achieved, two steps, again rising, all for us. And then the last line has a very different rhythm in a continuous series. Before thee we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. And we are not required to pause. There is no rising, simple, free flowing. But the flow itself ends with, all we owe to thee. And if you repeat this again and again, the prayer, you will find after a while the last line merges into the first line. When we bow down and implore that we may never forget, even for a moment, all we owe to thee. And the first line is, to thee who has been the material envelope. So all we owe to thee who has been the material envelope. And the whole cycle repeats again and again. And very suggestively, in this third line, we find, we implore that we may never forget, even for a moment. And so the cycle repeating as if continues the prayer in our heart. And the whole rhythm of these 5 lines continues automatically. So I wanted to share this as an example of how the physical rhythm of the words, the rhythm of the emotions and the rhythm of the ideas join into each other in a single powerful expression. And somewhere deep inside, the pauses, the silences, the gaps in between are the points where something of the soul leans forward to fill that space, to reach out, to experience, and to express the gratitude and the permanence of the memory. This is just an example of how we could take many of any of Sri Aurobindo's poems, but also many of the inspired prayers and formulations given by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and in the repetition as in a mantra, allow the being to flow along these rhythms, and then the full impact of the prayer is felt and has its multi-level result in our consciousness. We move now to the text itself, where we last read Sri Aurobindo now linking the word that we have so far been dwelling on in its highest station and its relationship with the human speech. In the mental consciousness, what is expressed by the word is not Brahman, but truths, forms, phenomena of Brahman. And Brahman is not and cannot be expressed by the word. He does not use the word here to express his very self, but is known only to his own self-awareness. Even the truths of himself that stand behind the forms of cosmic things are in their true reality always self-expressed to his eternal vision in a higher than the mental vibration, a rhythm and voice of themselves that is their own very soul of movement. So those great truths of Brahman are always there, even if they are not articulated into manifestation through the vak. But in relation, speech, a lesser thing, creates, expresses, but is itself only a creation and expression. So this speech itself belongs in this domain of phenomena, forms, of truths, and as if imitates that creative vak here in the domain of phenomena. And as a result, everything it can do, the highest it can reach, is nothing compared to what that vak reveals. And yet, there is something happening in the human speech, and this he describes, which is extremely important, and we will dwell on this for a while. We only touched upon it last time. And that which expresses speech in us brings it up out of our consciousness with its strivings to raise up the truth of things to our mind is Brahman himself as the word, a thing that is in the supreme superconscious. So what is it that compels this expression of speech in us? What is it that brings it up out of our consciousness to raise a truth of things to the mind? Something is felt, something is seen, something is sensed, and there is an urge to come forward, give expression before the mind. You will notice sometimes when the mind is not very trained, in little children, sometimes even in adults, you feel something you want to say, but as you try to express it, you stumble, you don't have the right words, you don't know what to say. And you go back and forth with the words until at some point something clicks and you say, yes, this is what I mean. And then you say the exact words that have come up. Until you brought it into the domain of speech, of mind, you yourself were not clear to you what it was you wanted to say. You were not clear in the domain of idea, in the domain of words, in the domain of form. But in the domain of experience, you felt wordlessly something important. What pushes from that experience to express, to try to communicate, to reach out to and share with other minds? And he says that is Brahman himself as the word, a thing that is in the supreme superconscious. That means every time that we speak to try to communicate something, the power which makes possible this expression and this communication and transmission of an experience to raise before the mind some truth, the power which makes this possible is Brahman as the word and belongs properly to the supreme superconscious. And yet, it is actually infused secretly inside this urge and the expression in our human speech. It is that which makes our speech meaningful and communicates an idea. Sometimes you will find children babbling. They just make a series of blue, 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 blue sounds. They're just enjoying the sense of the sound. To the intellect, it has no meaning. But to the feeling that the child has, it is very expressive. And this is how often we find twins growing up together develop spontaneously a very sophisticated language which only they understand among each other. And sometimes when these languages have been studied, they are almost as refined and complex in their development eventually as any of the existing human languages. But how did it originate? The urge to express in certain sounds, but within the sound was infused this power, the word, Brahman himself as the word, which conveyed the meaning proper. If on the other side, we try not to listen with our mind, but make the mind quiet and feel in that part of us which is the deeper listening, then as the child makes those babbling sounds, we receive the force behind those sounds and receive the experience that the child is trying to express or is expressing. Trying only in the domain of thought, of mind, but in the domain of the pure vibration, it is already expressing something. And in this way, you listen and you receive, you know. This is because we're in the domain of the body, where form in matter, form rules. And therefore, there has always to be something using form as a vehicle. But now, if the same interchange took place in the subtle body, let's say you approach the child now in the subtle form, and the child is still very young, perhaps less than a year old, and therefore still open to the immediate subtle physical in his consciousness, even in his vision sometimes. And you approach the child looks to you and expresses what is it that is in him, and you feel immediately in the contact of the vibration what the child is saying. In the subtle consciousness of the subtle body or the subtle physical even, you may hear it in words or you may hear it in thought, very precisely, very clearly stated. But because it is not in the domain of word form or sometimes even not idea form, when you remember that experience and narrate it, you will say, he said something like this. These are not the exact words, but this is what he meant to say. The meaning of the words has come through even though words were not used. And when you articulate now in human body and in human language, you have to find the closest matching human words. It is on this level that the most profound communications take place, most complete because undistorted by the limitations of human vocabulary, grammar, and speech. When people who are capable of expressing and receiving on this domain, on this level, communicate, they may still use words of human speech. There's a very interesting expression I recall reading, but which is a common feature in certain, I will say, original traditions, not still too mentalized, but still intuitive in their expression. And this was in a book called Rolling Thunder of a Native American medicine man. And the writer is listening to him speak to another wise elder of their community. And he starts speaking, he's narrating what happened. He starts speaking, and then as he speaks, both of them, as if close their eyes, they go into a kind of a drowsy state, and the speech becomes softer and softer until it is barely audible. And this person wonders what's happening between them. Perhaps the old man has gone to sleep. Perhaps he's not listening. But after the conversation is over, now spoken almost at a whispering level, the elder opens his eyes, bright, clear, and starts asking pointed questions, clearly revealing that he understood everything down to very subtle nuances. And it is precisely this transmission which takes place, starting with the support of human speech. The mind then can become quiet, and the consciousness can go to some inner level of the mind or heart or something still deeper and listen intently and receive directly. You will recall in this same chapter, Sri Aurobindo makes reference to the power, the theory of the mantra and the power of the mantra, where he says, it begins with the deeper consciousness from where the mantra emerges. Eventually, he says it is held in the waking consciousness and then thrown out silently or vocally. The silent word is perhaps held to be more potent than the spoken, precisely for the work of creation. And the silent word is held to be more potent than the spoken. In the mantric tradition, we are taught that the mantra can be chanted aloud, but if you want it to have its most powerful impact, you should reduce the volume to the level where it is barely audible even to yourself. And at that point, where you speak approaching silence, the mantra has the greatest power. Now we can begin to sense why this is so. Remember, within human speech, it is Brahman himself as the word who brings it up out of our consciousness to raise it, the truth of things, to the mind. And that speech, that movement of Brahman cannot be expressed by human speech, by form of vibration, but is closest and truest in its origin, approaching the silence of the vibration, or approaching the higher gradations of vibrations, which to the physical sound are like a silence. So as you speak, the physical vibration is as if reduced, and the subtler vibration continues and perhaps even is amplified because the physical vibration is reduced. And the communication now takes place intensified on those subtler levels of vibration. I remember a very poignant experience I had once listening to somebody called Dr. Kapila Vatsayana. She's a famous scholar, author, editor of many great works of art, of Indian culture, and so on. We were sitting together, a group of people, perhaps 5 or 6 of us, discussing certain things. And then for a moment she paused and began to narrate an experience. When she went to Kanyakumari, on the rock memorial where Swami Vivekananda meditated and had the vision of Mother India, she said she sat there in that temple and she looked. And as she began to speak, her voice began to grow softer and softer. brief pauses becoming long pauses. And it's as if she was expressing something for which there were no words. And she came to a point where the words stopped. And immediately in the whole group, we felt the experience that she had. It filled us, it overwhelmed us, and brought us to the brink of tears. And if at that point you asked yourself, what is it that I'm experiencing? The mind would probably be confused. I don't know what I'm experiencing, but I'm just overwhelmed as she's describing this experience that she had. And to this day, perhaps mentally, intellectually, I cannot remember what it was that was her experience. But I remember this mood, this movement of the emotions rising and being overwhelmed by this something felt intensely. And she stopped exactly at that point where there were no more words to speak. And in the silence, the true word could reach out, imprint itself. We also recall another incident which is narrated by my teacher, Sri M.P. Pandit, when a group from Karnataka had gone to meet the mother, and later one of the members of the group expressed a conversation that he had with the mother, a question that he asked and the answer that she gave. But the others were surprised. They said, this is not possible. You don't know English or French. You only know Kannada. How could you speak to the mother? He said, but I spoke to her in Kannada and she answered in Kannada. And they said, this is impossible. So the question was taken to the mother, and she explained that she first said, acknowledged, yes, that conversation took place, but she said there is a level of communication above speech, above language. And whatever he may have asked in his language, the communication on that level reached her, and she answered on that level. Whether physically she spoke the words in English or French are irrelevant, but he heard them in the language that he knew, or at least the mind translated it into the language that he knew. But the communication itself transcended language. And this is possible if we are in this way silent in the mind and receptive in the heart. And at that point, Brahman himself as the word who brings up this and reveals the truth to the mind is able to be felt and received directly. A thing that is in the supreme superconscious. But then we ask, how is it something belonging to the supreme superconscious is felt, is experienced, is present right here in the physical world, in our physical sounds of speech and mental thought? How is that possible? Because the error we make is to view these domains as successive in a series growing more and more distant, piled up one upon another. In our mind, we picture them as layers, and the higher the layers go, the farther it is. This is a representation, a symbolic representation. It is not the reality of things. The reality is that all these layers of consciousness are right here, right now, interpenetrating. The representation in a series with a distance represents the truth of their influence among each other. That is, from the physical to the vital, there is a stronger influence than from the physical to the mental or physical to the higher than mental. From the vital to the mental is closer in influence than, and so on. That distance of influence is represented in this symbolic picture that we draw of layers piled one upon the other. But the fact is, there is not a point where the vital ends in this line, after which in space you have the mental. They are all interpenetrating simultaneously. And so the vital is here, the mental is here, the supramental is here, the superconscious is here. And the word in the superconscious is also here, but at a level of vibration so subtle that it does not influence the physical as directly as it influences the mental, through which therefore it can influence the vital, through which it can influence the physical, because of their closeness of similarity of vibration. So the highest passes through vibrations all through all these levels, all the way to the most material, because that is the passage most easy in influence. And yet, that highest is present right now, interpenetrating the physical also. Because it is there, the physical is held and supported. And because it is there, it also expresses itself, represents itself, however subtly. In its most subtle, it approaches that which we know as silence. And so, as the mantra fades out, in the physical vibration, that higher vibration can fill the gap of the silence. And the silence surges in to fill as the physical vibration fades out. That word, speech of our speech, is in its essence of power the eternal himself, and in its supreme movements a part of his very form and everlasting spiritual body. So seen in this way, there is a form of Brahman. But the form is not, as in the domain of matter, a form that cuts out and separates. In the material universe, because of the nature of matter being made up of divided consciousness, form is known only by reference to what it is not. So a flower is flower because of the empty space around it against which we see the flower. If that same flower was not now put inside a liquid, you do not see anymore the flower as flower. If the liquid solidifies, now it is inside, let's say, molten wax, and the wax solidifies, you do not see flower anymore because the wax and the flower have joined. The edge is no more seen to our sight. But the flower itself still remains flower, only it is not visible to our distinguishing sight. You take a sheet of glass. You see it glass because it reflects light. If it was perfectly transparent and there was no reflection, you would not see the glass, as happens occasionally, and we walk into a glass sheet, not realizing that there was a glass there. Put that glass inside water and you will not see it at all. And then effectively the glass does not exist to our sight because we know only by separation of glass versus not glass. To the consciousness of Brahman, form is not known by separation. Form is known by completeness, by free expression. Not bound to the distinction of divisions in space and time. It is a totality of himself, that is his form. And all the ranges of colors of his powers, vibrations, qualities of consciousness, infinite quality, Ananta Guna, that is the very form and everlasting spiritual body, Brahmano Rupam. Rupa is form of Brahman. But that word, speech of our speech, is in its essence of power the eternal himself, and in its supreme movements a part of his very form. His form is greater. This is only a part of his very form. It is something of this form or an aspect of this form at time which was revealed to Arjuna by Sri Krishna. And it was so overwhelming that Arjuna had to ask for it to be stopped because he was overwhelmed even with fear by the intensity and power of the form, but still an aspect as Kala, as time. So when we speak of the Brahman himself as the word who lifts our speech and conveys to the mind, it is because that is there here and because it is able to engage with our speech and enter and infuse itself in it that this possibility exists of communicating an idea. Now think about this, and this is a theme for meditation and even for introspection. And it draws out a very profound experience when we dwell on it. Think about it this way. When someone speaks certain words, what is it that provokes in you an image or an experience that is transmitted by the words? An idea, perhaps. He says, I am going home. And as you listen to these sound vibrations, which are nothing but vibrations in the air, if you displayed it on the computer screen, you would just see a series of squiggles. Your ear somehow translates them into electrical vibrations going to the brain, but after that, something amazing happens. In the brain, that vibration is converted into sound quality and sensation, which is not squiggles, which has a harmony, a sound which says, I am going. And the going has a softness, a flow to it. Home has a certain feeling to it, even a sensation. And all this experience is taking place where? Not in the physical domain of vibration. It is taking place on the subtler levels of life vibration and mind vibration. The brain is only like a translator, a resonator, which translates physical electrical vibrations to those vibrations, or receives those and translates into physical electrical vibrations. And the actual registration of the sound and the sound value and the musical value of the sound is taking place already in our subtle body, even in the mental body to a great extent. The aesthetic part of music is experienced in the mental body. That's why the mother says music and mathematics belong properly to the domain of the mind. They are not physical realities in that sense. And as you listen and that vibration forms, it somehow translates into an idea, I, going, and home. And the am gives the sense of time. How does that word sound or even the musical quality of it translate into idea? What's the mechanism of translation by which you suddenly know the meaning and experience the truth of the meaning? If you dwell on it, you cannot come to a very simple explanation. Something happens and it gets translated. It can get translated because something within me already knows the meaning of that sentence, already knows the meaning of I, of home, of going, of am, the sense of time. All these are held. The words forming in front, the sound, the feel of it evokes from within me the meaning which was already held within me. In other words, the vak of the Brahman within, the word as Brahman, draws out within me the experiential sense of the words which reached my mind. How does it draw that out? Who drew it out? What was transmitted on the other side by the vak filling those words, reaching my consciousness, listening, which is nothing but the Brahman consciousness itself, resonating and drawing out by resonance what was already within him in this form of my mentality, in the individual mind that I am. But the experience itself takes place in cosmic mind. I am identified with the small part which picks up this little bit. If somehow my mind could widen itself and align and identify with the cosmic mind, I would hear not only these words spoken to me, but all words spoken to all beings and all thoughts expressed in all beings at the same time, because that's how Brahman is listening to himself, expressing himself. And so when you read this sentence, it has something so profound. That which expresses speech in us brings it up out of our consciousness with its strivings to raise up the truth of things to our mind is Brahman himself as the word, a thing that is in the supreme superconscious. And then he says the next paragraph, therefore it is not the happenings and phenomena of the world that we have to accept finally as our object of pursuit, but that which brings out from itself the word by which they were thrown into form for our observation by the consciousness and for our pursuit by the will. In other words, the supreme existence that has originated all. Now we can see this purely in that power of creation in which all these forms are put and the phenomena, but we can also see it in our individual human life and interchange of communication. It is that which throws out the word. It is that which receives and hears the word within us also. And there is a whole communication of Brahman with Brahman at its highest level, not bound to the limitations of the material phenomena. But that's what upholds, informs all the phenomena. And it is that which is real within the phenomena. So we should not chase after the happenings and phenomena of the world and make those the object of pursuit, but that which brings out from itself the word, by which they were thrown into form for our observation by consciousness. When someone speaks, it is that power of the word which throws out those forms for our observation by consciousness and for our pursuit by the will. But we should not pursue the forms, we should rather seek to know and to feel that which is behind those forms, which creates those forms. In other words, the supreme existence that has originated all. And where is it? Yes, it is also there in its highest transcendence. It is also there presiding over, filling the totality of the universe in past, present, and future. It is also here within us individually, in each form, in each communication, in each thought, in each experience. It is that which raises, upholds that experience, carries within the experience the essence, the meaning of the experience, and reveals to us who are experiencing the experience. And if you think of it this way, the pursuit of Brahman is not an abandonment from life. It is not an abandonment of the poverty of human speech and human communication and human form and phenomena. It is rather the pursuit of the sap of reality which is woven into all this, which hides behind the screen of phenomena but reveals itself through the phenomena. And to put our attention, our observation, and our pursuit by will towards that, that is what we should focus on. That's what the verse tells us when it says, that which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed, know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. And so he says finally in the last paragraph, human speech is only a secondary expression and at its highest a shadow of the divine word, of the seed sounds, the satisfying rhythms, the revealing forms of sound that are the omniscient and omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker, harmonist, creator. So now straight away, these two are put against each other. Human speech and that highest vaka. And the two are placed next to each other. The highest inspired speech to which the human mind can attain, the most unanalyzably expressive of supreme truth, the most puissant syllable or mantra can only be its far-off representation. So different are these two. And yet, in juxtaposing them, Sri Aurobindo is showing us how that organizes itself through those levels into the material speech. And again, we are reminded of what it is. At its highest, human speech is a shadow of the divine word, of the seed sounds, the shadow of the divine word, the shadow of the seed sounds, the shadow of the satisfying rhythms, the shadow of the revealing forms of sound. What are they in their origin? That are the omniscient and omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker, harmonist, creator. So just above, in the original creative vaka, is the omniscient and omnipotent speech. When that vibration goes out, it is all including, all knowing, and all compelling, all manifesting. Nothing can oppose that, nothing can be different from that. There is only that all inclusive single movement manifesting. From where? Eternal thinker, harmonist, creator. And immediately we are reminded of the lines from the Isha Upanishad: Kavir, Manishi, Paribhu, Swayambhu. Again, describing the manifesting movement, he describes first the status of the seer, the Lord as he sees, and he sees himself in his totality and casts out of that totality the seeing of a specific power, aspect, form, experience. That's the Kavi. And then that translates into the thinker, the Manishi, who brings into domain of distinction and separation of form, contrasting this against that. And then Paribhu, who manifests in the domain of form, of matter finally. But always it is self-expressed spontaneously, Swayambhu. So the same idea, but the emphasis is different. The omniscient and omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker. This is the Manishi. But behind that, harmonist, we're going from below upwards. So first thinker is what we meet, but as a cosmic mind. Above that, the harmonist, and above that, the creator. And what is this harmonist? And what's the state linking the creator who manifests from the unmanifest into manifestation? Then there is the harmonist, and then the thinker who places in distinctions of form and arrangement. And the harmonist is the station where everything is held in harmony. All is known, but all is perfectly in relation with everything else, in perfect harmony. Everything is as if simultaneously present, and yet there are distinctions, even in simultaneity. This is the nature of harmony. When in the domain of music, we express a harmony, there are multiple notes simultaneously, but they are as if in their resonances supporting each other. And together they reveal more than they would individually. Something like this happens in this station, which here described as the harmonist, describes actually the status of the supramental consciousness. All possibilities held in perfect relation of organization, arrangement, in perfect harmony with each other. And then from there it moves to the thinker, where certain facets are put out, and subsequently there is the possibility of conflict or opposition of all these different forms and forces. So there's a whole rising description, starting from human speech as a shadow, the word, the seed sounds, satisfying rhythms, revealing forms of sound that are the omniscient, omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker, harmonist, creator. But he has touched the seed sounds, satisfying rhythms, and revealing forms of sound. And now suddenly we see how all these are as if a link between the power of human speech and the highest station of Vak. And this is the reason why in the ancient tradition, in the yogic and the Sanskrit traditions, sounds and sacred sounds were given so much importance. And this is separate from the mantra and the theory of mantra itself. It is as if the original vibrational sound translating into human sound, into seed sounds, was a manifestation of divinity, even a revelation of divinity, and represented in the domain of human speech the divine himself. And this is the reason why the sacred sounds, as they move into manifestation, are described as being not of human origin. The Veda is described as apaurushaya, meaning not from human origin. Although a rishi may still be the transcriber of the mantra, he only transcribes in human speech at that particular moment of space and time, what was always present in the eternity and was always there in the Vak of that eternal thinker, harmonist creator in his omniscience and omnipotent speech. And so the Veda, when articulated thus, are treated as sacred. Or the mantra, when revealed thus, is treated as sacred. And even the rhythms of human speech and sound and the knowledge linking them to that, when revealed, is treated as sacred. There's a whole field of study exploring this relationship. In its crude intellectual form, we call it grammar, because that's all that the modern human mind understands and knows of language. And so they translate the Sanskrit word into the English equivalent of grammar. But the Sanskrit original word does not mean just grammar as we understand it. It means precisely the study of this relationship, this linking. And Panini is one of the great grammarians, as you know, as is popularly said. He wrote out all the rules of Sanskrit grammar in a series of sutras, which are like a computer program. You can apply them to any sentence in Sanskrit and they reveal the precise meaning, even multiple meanings if they exist, and so on. So he is the first grammarian, as they say, but that's not true. He himself, if he sat down and worked it out logically, could not have created the grammar structure with this kind of a elegance and perfection. It had to be a revealed manifestation of knowledge by which his Ashtadhyayi, the text of the grammar rules, was articulated. But the story actually tells you this with a further step before he writes his Ashtadhyayi. And the story goes thus. Because Panini was a little dull as a student, he was not very intelligent, he was advised to do tapas, to gain knowledge. And there's the whole story. But at some point in his tapasya, Shiva himself appears before him and dances. Now, Shiva is extremely important, and Shiva's dance is extremely important. That is the rhythms, the creative rhythms by which the whole cosmos is formed. His dance is the creative dance. It is also the dance of extinction, of destruction of the rhythms, of change of the rhythms. That is why in the integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo refers to that aspect of Shiva, Nataraja, the Lord of rhythms, as the Lord of transformation. Because it is he who can modify the existing rhythms into the new rhythms and thus transform nature. But the dance of Shiva represents this, the rhythms by which things move into manifestation. And Shiva dances before Panini, and he shakes his drum. The drum is the symbol of his power of manifesting rhythms. But he shakes the rhythms 14 times. And each time that he shakes them, a series of vibrations come out, which is described as the Shiva Sutra. They go something like this. I will recite them rapidly. They don't make sense at all when heard purely as sounds, even in the Sanskrit language. They are sutras capturing the essential rhythms of the language itself. And from there you derive all the rules of grammar. So it goes like this. There's even an invocation describing this whole scene of Shiva dancing, which I do not have, and how he shakes the drum, and these sounds emerge from the drum. And the sounds go I-un, Rilrik, A-on, I-ouch, Hayavarat, Lan, Nyamangananam, Jabhai, Gadadash, Jabagadadash, Kapachathatha Chat, Kapachathatha Chatatap, Kapai, Shashasar, Hal. If you think about it, it doesn't make sense at all. And yet, in grouping these sounds in this way, The linking principles which unite these sounds are as if articulated, of which the 2000 verses of the grammar rules of Panini, which is like a computer program, are an elaboration. All those 2000 are held innately in this 14 sutras. And so, in order to master Sanskrit grammar, you learn these 14 sutras. And after that, when you're told the rules, you say, oh, yeah, that's obvious, that's simple, that's so natural, and everything comes out of it so easily. They are also at the same time representing every single possible vowel and consonant of the Sanskrit language. So it is as if the language itself emerges from the rhythmic beats of Shiva's drum as he is dancing and moving things into the rhythms of manifestation. And that's the origin of human speech, of human language. And these verses, therefore, are the Shiva Sutras and are sacred. They are the things which link the Vak in its highest creative vibration and rhythm to the human speech, which is a secondary expression and at its highest a shadow of the divine word, of the seed sounds, the satisfying rhythms, the revealing forms of sound that are the omniscient and omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker, harmonist, creator. The highest inspired speech to which the human mind can attain, the word most unanalyzably expressive of supreme truth, the most puissant syllable or mantra can only be its far-off representation. And yet, as a representation, it expresses something of that, it manifests that, and it gives the human vehicle the capacity to share in the divine creative Vak. As the human consciousness now moves from the mental to the supramental, this creative power will become more and more direct until in the supramental consciousness, it will be perfectly aligned with the creative Vak of that omniscient and omnipotent speech of the eternal thinker, harmonist, and creator. The next chapter now links with this in this sense. This chapter was speech of our speech, and the next chapter is mind of our mind, which is the supramental consciousness behind the human mind. And so the Vak belongs properly to the supramental consciousness, both of which are behind the human speech and the human mind. And as the human consciousness rises from mind to supermind, its speech also rises from the human speech to the Vak of Brahman. And the next chapter takes up the next verse, which goes thus: that which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And Sri Aurobindo will follow exactly the same pattern, showing us how the human mind is related to the supramental consciousness and how the two are interconnected and the linking principles between the two. So the next chapter is titled The Necessity of Supermind, which we will take up next Sunday.